Well, beloved, our first reading comes from the book of Ecclesiastes. And the title of this book takes different forms in different translations. Ecclesiastes is a Greek word that means the one who gathers together. In English, this has sometimes been called the preacher or the teacher. Modern translations tend towards using the Hebrew title the author gives himself, Qohelet. And it sits in the part of the biblical library among the poetry, with Psalms, Proverbs, and the other books. There's another book it sometimes gets confused with, Ecclesiastes, which was written much later in Greek and is not part of the Hebrew Bible. Catholics have Ecclesiasticus, usually called the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, mixed in with the Old Testament. Most Protestants discard it as non-scriptural, and Anglicans put it with several other books in a special place between the Old and New Testaments called the Apocrypha. Now, this is the only time in the 3-year lectionary cycle we read from Ecclesiastes. We actually read from Ecclesiasticus several other times. And Ecclesiastes is probably best known for chapter 3. Everything has a season and a time for every matter under the heavens, a time to be born, a time to die. If you know 60s folk rock, you probably know this chapter from the Byrds' Turn, Turn, Turn. The author is self-identified as Qohelet, the teacher or the preacher in Hebrew. He calls himself a son of King David and a king in Jerusalem, so he's often been historically identified as King Solomon, although the Hebrew used in this book is much later than that used in the time of Solomon. The book is kind of the bad boy of Old Testament wisdom literature. If the book of Proverbs is a successories poster, then Ecclesiastes is a demotivational one. It all revolves around the Hebrew word hevel, which is used 38 times in Ecclesiastes, and it's a fairly short book. It's the first word in the book after the ascription and the last word before the epilogue. Ecclesiastes starts off with a piece of poetic art, havel havelim, which acts to increase the meaning of this word. The NRSV we heard today translates this: vanity of vanity, says the teacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The Jewish Publication Society version in the same translation family reads, utter futility, said Qohelet. Utter futility, all is futile. Another recent translation reads, absurdity of absurdities. My personal favorite is the Robert Alter translation that was just released this year, which I'll use for the rest of the quotes in this sermon. Merest breath, said Qohelet. Merest breath. All is mere breath. And that's the meaning of hevel. It's an ephemeral mist or breath, like the light fog over a pond minutes before the rising sun burns it away, or like human breath on a crisp fall day that exists but for a few seconds. And the teacher says this over and over again in this book. Everything is breath. It is mere breath. The teacher has a lot to say about our lot as human beings. He has an unusual take on God and the creation. He says, it is an evil business that God gave to the sons of man to busy themselves with. And he's particularly scornful about excessive and needless toil in the reading today. For what does a man have from all his toil and from his heart's care that he toils under the sun? For all his days are pain, and worry is his business. At night as well, his heart does not rest. This too is mere breath. In this short book, the teacher identifies 3 pleasures in life that are good and fitting. The first are sensual pleasures, simple pleasures of food, drink, sleep, and he talks about sunlight on your skin. Or relational pleasures, the goods of friendship and romantic love. Or vocational pleasures. While the teacher calls burdensome and excessive toil mere breath, he celebrates the enjoyment of work that brings fulfillment. And he notes that these pleasures are given by God, for apart from God, who can eat or who can have enjoyment. This verb, forgive, occurs 28 times in the book, 15 times referring to a gift from God. My Hebrew Scriptures teacher, Ellen Davis, sums up the central message of Ecclesiastes as, life can never be mastered or shaped in conformity with our desires. It can only be enjoyed when pleasures great or small come our way, or when enjoyment is not possible, it must be endured. And while this is a very different message from some other parts of the Bible, it speaks deeply to many in our culture. It's a book that's radically critical of religiosity, especially a religiosity that equates prosperity with God's favor. Dr. Davis notes that a chaplain in the Vietnam War related that it was the only part of the Bible that his soldiers were willing to listen to. She also tells the story of a student of hers suffering from depression who told her that reading Ecclesiastes was like slipping into a warm bath. And I can't imagine how churches reading Ecclesiastes resonates with those in Gilroy, South Haven, El Paso, and Dayton this morning. All is mere breath. Jesus would no doubt have been familiar with Ecclesiastes, and we hear echoes of its teaching in the parable of the rich fool this morning. Jesus' parables are always told in a context, and the context is important to understanding what he's saying. Nothing we can do can hurt the Bible more than reading stuff out of context. Just before we reach our reading today, Jesus has gathered a crowd around himself and has been teaching them about the love of God. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten in God's sight. But even the hairs of your head are all counted. Do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. Now, it's easy for God to count my hairs. But you get the point. A few verses later, at the beginning of today's reading, a man interrupts Jesus' teaching to try to get him to intervene in a dispute with his brother. Now, it's not unusual for people to ask rabbis to mediate disputes. That's part of what they do. But the brother has not been listening, obviously, and the demand is completely out of context considering what Jesus has been saying. So Jesus tells the parable. A rich man has an abundant harvest. Now, the problem is not that he's rich or that he has an abundant harvest. The problem is not even that he eats, drinks, and is merry. The teacher of Ecclesiastes would approve of that. But the rich man is completely self-centered. The parable is replete with the first person singular. He says, I, over and over again. He even talks about himself in the third person, like a character from Seinfeld. Soul, you have ample goods laid up. I mean, who says that to themselves? That was no more normal back then than it is today. When confronted with the abundance, instead of thinking how the overflow might be used for the greater good, he builds bigger barns so that he can hoard it. St. Augustine of Hippo, in his commentary on this passage, pointed out that he's hoarding perishable crops. Even had he lived, they wouldn't have lasted long enough for the rich man to consume them all. As humans, we're anxious creatures. It's something that seems to be baked into who we are, and we try to make our own security by surrounding ourselves with wealth beyond what we can use, but it never seems to work. In modern America, we're awash in anxieties. Despite the fact that life expectancies are higher than any time in human history, the homicide rate and auto accident rates are lower than they have ever been, and the United States controls almost a full quarter of the wealth of the world. Life expectancy is lower and homicide rates are higher in America than other developed countries with less of the world's wealth, but that doesn't change the fact that we live longer, are safer, and control more wealth than at any time in our history. But yet our public rhetoric is best personified by the character of anger from the 2015 Pixar film Inside Out. Anger and blame are the political coin of the day. We look for scapegoats. While most of us are more prosperous and safer than our forebears, it's not necessarily true for members of minorities in our society. As a person who does a lot of regular interfaith and ecumenical work, I have never seen our fellow American citizens in Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, and Hispanic and African American Christian communities as concerned as they are as to what their future is in this, their native country. And let me be clear, this is not just about how they feel, it's their actual lived experience. In just one local example, anti-Semitic incidents in Milwaukee increased 20% from 2017 to 2018. My colleagues in the African American Christian community talk about a rise in openly racist language and graffiti. And all around us, incidents of hate crime are rising at a measurable, statistically provable, alarming rate. We are seeing the effect of that hate on the ground, in one shooting after another, by killers who openly espouse white supremacist rhetoric. After a week like this, it is trite to talk about thoughts and prayers as a response. Yet, as people of faith, prayer is where we start, not to change God's mind, but to open ours to see God's will for this world and to gain the strength to carry it out. But if prayer is our entire response, then this too is mere breath. This last week, our National Cathedral released a statement from its clergy and the Episcopal Bishop of Washington asking, "Have we no decency?" Meaning that the blame for this rise in hate rests on our entire society unless we speak out about it and say that we have had enough. It reads in part, "As leaders of faith who believe in the sacredness of every single human being, the time for silence is over. We must boldly stand witness against the bigotry, hatred, intolerance, and xenophobia that is hurled at us. We must say that this will not be tolerated. To stay silent in the face of such rhetoric is for us to tacitly condone the violence of these words. We are compelled to take every opportunity to oppose the indecency and dehumanization that is racism, whether it comes to us through words or actions." The Roman Catholic Archbishop of Washington likewise has stated, "I have stressed that I am a pastor and fellow disciple of Jesus, not a political leader. There are, however, some times when a pastor and a disciple of Jesus is called to speak out to defend the dignity of all of God's children." Our society is going through rapid demographic change, which is making a lot of people nervous. Yet we live at a time of unparalleled prosperity, unthinkable to our ancestors. Why are we so afraid as a society? Why are we willing to forego the compassion that is at the heart of all of our human wisdom traditions? How can a nation that some claim to be Christian continue to become less and less Christ-like? This too is vanity of vanities, absurdity of absurdity, merest breath. It's us looking at our barn full of an abundant harvest and deciding that what we need to do with the surplus is build another bigger barn. As our presiding bishop is fond of saying, when love is the way, there's plenty good room for all of God's children. We are all to enjoy the gifts God has given us. It's right to eat, drink, and be merry. It is for our own sanity that we sometimes need to disengage from the wheel of public discourse. We all come to this beautiful building and community on Sunday morning from a variety of places with a variety of needs. And I hope you're able to leave this place fed by the word and by the bread and wine, the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. I hope this can be a place where we concentrate on the things that are eternal and not the merest breath. I hope you find a measure of rest here. But I also hope you leave challenged to be a more compassionate person in your personal and public life, because we are all showered with such an abundance of God's love that we would be like the rich fool to remain unchanged by this feast. All is mere breath, said the teacher, yet God numbers the hairs on the head of every one of his beloved children. Amen.